report as the season gets going here, and the Celtics are 2-0 after their home opening win against the Heat. Want to dig deeper on this one, this matchup in general this year, because I thought it was another intriguing matchup in what's become a long line of them between these two teams. The East Finals rematch, Celtics get their revenge here against a short-handed Heat team. I forgot to mention that last night. It is important to mention that Caleb Martin was out, Josh Richardson out, a number of Heat out tonight. Jimmy Butler's resting. It looked like he was resting last night too, Brady, as I welcome you in here.
For sure.
A weird game, a bit of a classic Jimmy Butler game where regular season game at least, where he floats around for most of it, passes, tries to turn it up late, and honestly, you got to give Derek White a lot of credit because in those moments where Jimmy tried to turn it up, he got the 3 blocks and swung Butler's game in the wrong direction, and probably this game on its head, and what was, I'd say for 3/4, Miami's game.
For sure. I mean, I think everybody on the Heat side was looking for Jimmy to find his rhythm at a certain point, just because you mentioned the word floating, and that's what Jimmy was doing. It was a lot of floating around, letting Tyler and Bam basically handle the whole time, and Jimmy was off ball a lot. That's the big difference between regular season Jimmy and playoff Jimmy in the Celtics series. Like, you see the usage difference compared to what we saw. Obviously, Tyler being involved is a big difference, but he doesn't have the ball as much. And when he doesn't have the ball, it's harder to find a rhythm. And the kind of the plays you mentioned, like those fast break opportunities and stuff that he wasn't able to capitalize on, those were the points where it was like, okay, he can find his rhythm now. And obviously Boston was able to kind of cut those type of plays off in general. So yeah, it was definitely he's resting tonight, but he definitely felt like he was resting a good bit of that game yesterday. But hey, it's still, you mentioned the guys out. It was still a pretty good matchup. It's one of those clear Miami-Boston games down to the end, kind of throwing haymakers back and forth at each other with under 2 minutes to go. It's just a classic rivalry, I guess, at this stage.
Yes, and a bit of a different look to it, of course. Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis joined the Boston side. We'll get to them and your reactions to those changes. But the Heat, it's going to be an adjustment for them too this year. Losing Gabe Vincent, Max Strus, outstanding in that debut for the Cavs with 27 points. Missed him in this one. And Richardson will try to fill that sun. A couple of the other guys that were out in this game. But obviously those guys are out. And Hero comes in after missing most of that playoff run. And he was impressive in this one. I thought he and Bam in that handoff game really challenged Porzingis. The Heat were well prepared to go after the drop defense that killed New York on opening night. And ended up fouling out Porzingis, putting him in foul trouble early, making him defend out in space. I thought Hero was really good in this one up until very late. And a nice dynamic for the Heat, but the trade-off, obviously, with Vincent out, Strus out, is that I noticed the Heat have to put those vulnerable defenders out there on the floor for a little bit longer, whether it's Hero. Drew Smith, I think, had a tough time staying in front of Jaylen Brown in this one. Down the line, Kyle Lowry even was a guy that Boston could hunt in this game. So the Heat look better offensively than they did at points last year in this one with the new personnel. But defensively, the Celtics, especially late, were able to go after some of those smaller guards and mismatches and win the game with some good execution.
Yeah, they definitely, I mean, from a Heat perspective, I think a lot of fans were mad at the the small lineups that Miami was throwing out there just because it didn't feel like they were doing a lot of positive. Number one, if you're playing like a Drew Smith, Kyle Lowry, Tyler Hero lineup, the one thing you should be able to do is take care of the basketball. And the one thing that Boston was doing was forcing turnovers. So it's like, if you're not taking care of the ball on the offensive end in that lineup, what is it out there for? And I thought a lot of Boston's offensive runs was within that lineup, especially because whoever caught that ball in Boston's offense, whoever was the initial trigger, they were sending that second guy immediately. And what is Boston's offense good at? Making the quick read and sending that pass to the opposite corner, and all of a sudden they're getting a Derek White 3 or a Drew Holiday 3. So I think you saw a lot of that, of them trying to like make up for the fact that they didn't have the size to compete one-on-one with those Boston guys. And yeah, they had a lot of their poor defenders out there late in the game. Specifically, the late game offense for Boston was whoever Kevin Love was guarding, put him in the pick and roll. Kevin Love, we know what's going to happen there. He's not a guy anymore that's really sitting and drop. He's going to blitz out and kind of force you to get the ball out of your hands. They did a lot of that. They were able to make those reads down the stretch, and they were able to score a couple of those times at that point. I think the big difference is Miami's not going to have that lineup closing many times. Like you mentioned, Caleb is going to be closing most games. Haywood Highsmith's another guy we haven't mentioned, but he's going to actually be closing a lot of games for Miami when healthy. And then obviously we'll see what Josh looks like when he gets back in the fold. So I think ideally it's funny because it's like we're talking about Miami looking more kind of polished offensively and weaker defensively. And everybody coming into the season was finding out the flip way. It was like, how are they going to be able to score? And they found ways to score against that Boston team, actually. And they was kind of going back and forth in that way. So I thought that part of it was interesting. But yeah, Porzingis definitely changes you mentioned him, changes the dynamic, obviously, for that offense. Kevin Love they mixed kind of different coverages around, but having to like have a guy that has to guard the perimeter in that way and stretch the floor, moves things around. They put Bam on Jaylen Brown, obviously, to start that game. Kind of once again it's a really fun matchup because it's not something you see a lot where they have to like move around so many matchups. Because we can go back to the regular season last year or the playoffs. Like there's been so many different individual assignments that have changed on both sides. Like each game, they kind of move the pieces around a little bit. So I think that's a fun thing to track. But obviously, the Porzingis thing is a little bit more difficult to track, I guess, for Spo right now with this roster.
Yeah, definitely. And he still made his impact out there, especially sealing some smaller guys in transition after he didn't get many threes to go early. It was a 3-point barrage for him on opening night. And I was talking to Jalen after, and he said he felt like Miami was trying to cut him off a little bit with Kevin Love and some other guys out there from the 3-point line. So they moved him inside and he did some damage in there. I mean, my favorite play of the night was obviously the pass he made out of the double team. We really haven't seen a lot of Porzingis' passing yet, but get him in the post, and he is able to draw multiple defenders in there, and he made a great skip pass to Jalen for one of the bigger shots down the line of this game. And you mentioned it, the corners were open. You had a lot of hedging by Miami in this game that opened up guys across the perimeter. And as much as, I was kind of stuck, maybe it was because where I was sitting, just stuck on how much of a problem Bam was giving Boston. And Boston obviously went small around Porzingis in this one. Didn't play Horford a ton at the 4. I don't think they actually played him at all at the 4 in this one. So Miami found ways to exploit the wings and Porzingis directly. I thought Bam was outstanding in this game, posting up and facing up guys. One of his better offensive games I've seen against the Celtics. And I'm sitting there going, oh, geez, why'd the Celtics start small? But on the other end, they're just spreading Miami out and really stressing them. I mean, this is a Heat team that in recent years has had Boston's number, had all the answers, and they had a few in this one. But when the Celtics really started executing their sets and getting the ball to the weak side for shooters to knock down shots, whether it was White, Brown, Holiday had some nice shots on the roll late too. They just found open space constantly. And there was never really a stretch outside of a few frantic plays earlier in the game where it looked like the Heat solved what the Celtics were doing out there. And it's going to be challenging too when you have 5 scorers and creators on the floor for Boston.
For sure. And I think that the play of Derek White, I suppose after the game, like he's no longer a secret. He's not a
Oh, he's
surprise when he
incredible,
has
huh?
these type of plays. But still, when you have that many options out on the floor, when you're talking about the main 4 guys, he's still the guy that you're somewhat dipping off of and forcing those floaters to. Like they always talk about kind of like Miami's defense, that is what they do. They force the kind of middle of the floor floater, inefficient shot. That's what they try to do. They try to pick the guy that they want taking them. Not that Derek White is the worst floater player in that lineup, but it's just the guy that's able to get to those spots. And he was just making them last night. He was hitting them really consistently. I thought he had really good touch in that spot. And that really was what opened things up, because now that's the part probably more than anything it forces you to shift the defense. Is now when you're like, okay, we have to now play a little bit higher on Derek White when he gets to that mid range. And now all of a sudden they're sending this guy back door and they're floating this guy baseline. It's like that's the counters that Boston particularly has. And obviously it does not help once again when Kyle and Kevin Love are closing and having to make up for so much defensively and cover ground. Like there was a play where Kyle was the weak side defender. I don't even remember who ended up shooting it, but somebody hit a 3 and he like had a late contest, but it was not even almost a contest. Like he just jumped in the air and it was like, okay, this is not really
The
where you want to
Cornet
be.
contest.
Basically, but pretty much the opposite of that, I guess, because I don't know if he really got off the floor for the contest. But
Yeah.
and then you mentioned Bam. I thought Bam did have a really good game. I thought the difference with him, I kind of believed that he was going to get a lot of jumpers up in this matchup specifically yesterday. And it felt like he was just really attacking. Like he came out the gate really attacking. That Boston didn't really send many doubles at him or send a lot of help at him. It was basically like one-on-one with Porzingis, just use your speed to your advantage, try to get to that baseline and try to work an angle. And he was able to kind of use the rim as his protection and kind of get good shots around the rim off. So I thought that was a good sign. And obviously, you mentioned the action that was more important than anything. It was insert the Bam in the mid post, Tyler comes off a handoff, and it felt like there was almost every lineup they were in. That was like the one thing that was smoothly operated offensively and got them into the right spot. So that was kind of their main thing, but defensively for sure uh, was tough down the stretch with that lineup, as you said.
Yeah, and they were willing to live with that. It got frustrating at points, and the Heat had that 5, 6 point lead throughout running those actions. But I almost wonder if the Heat spamming that a little bit led to Jimmy ending up out of the offense for much of this game because you pretty much were wondering when he was going to turn it up, and he never really did. And that ended up being probably the difference in the game. He's just not a guy who's gonna really assert himself until later in the year, and he wants other guys to shoot. He wants other guys to find their rhythm. And you're sitting there as a Celtics fan probably and just breathing a sigh of relief that that's the case.
For sure, for sure. And I think the issue with it is you're also seeing the role players for Boston kind of kick in and give those much needed plays where Miami's like core role players aren't in there. And they have these other guys in here. They're Miami's kind of
I was
looking
getting
around
ready
like,
for the Drew Smith game. He hit a couple shots early, but then he
oh
got
my.
attacked and he was out of there.
No, I don't think I think Miami fans were not really thinking that was coming, but he actually played better than I think a lot of fans thought he would. Like 3 or 4
Yeah.
from three, you'll take that from Drew Smith. Like that's something you'll take. But I think that was kind of the big thing was like they didn't have that extra punch from whoever, a Caleb, a Josh. They didn't have like that extra punch where it's like
Thomas
if
Bryant struggled. Yeah.
yeah, he was another guy that did struggle. I think he was he didn't really attack or look to score at all. But it's like when you don't have that and Jimmy's coasting, that's just a lot on Tyler and Bam's plate. Like they did not have that third punch from anybody at that point. I thought Kyle gave them good minutes. I thought Kyle was assertive. He was aggressive and took shots. He was efficient. Uh, but still, it was not like that much needed extra punch like a Derek White gave them or somebody else. Like there was different good minutes I thought Boston had with the role players that kicked in. And I was like, okay, like the rebounding, the offensive rebounding was obviously another topic we could have that I thought that was punishing Miami. But yeah, I thought the overall kind of third punch was kind of what was missing on Miami's side.
Yeah, Joe loves offensive rebounding. I think it's going to be a big thing for this
Mm,
team this year. I think he admired the way the Hawks did it against them in the playoffs, and now they just get the personnel to do it. They're going to sell out on
yeah.
that and try to get those extra chances. They create good threes too, of course. I think the Celtics got a extra 3 or 2 here or there off those
Mhm,
offensive rebounds. O'Shea Brissett came in and gave them 3
yeah.
after not playing on opening nights. There was another role contribution that Boston got there. So you got a top 6 here that's pretty dangerous, and I'll get your just thoughts on Boston coming into this year. They're prohibitive favorite, of course. You see what they're capable of at their best. The Porzingis factor, him playing at this level and stretching defenses out, and he had this offensive rebound. If we're going to stay on that topic, where he just kind of smacked the ball off the glass, grabbed it, and just dunked on Love's head
Mm,
at one point. He's raining down threes on opening night. He's really got people excited. The rim protection, I think, has been pretty good too. Better than expected, I think. And then this game, he faced a challenge where Bam was going at him directly and outpowering him. He's still not a guy who's going to really hold his ground the way we saw Horford do in recent years and Grant Williams even. But as far as just covering space and using length and playing that drop spot, he's about as good as anyone you can think of at that spot. His pick and roll numbers were amazing last year, and now you're seeing it play out for this team. And the defense has me most excited because the offense speaks for itself with him. He's just going to hit shots and score a ton.
for sure. He's a prototypical type of stretch big that you'd want in that system. It makes a lot of sense for their top guys. I think just the overall view, uh, I like I was saying before, I thought the matchups were a fun thing to track because it's not like a normal five guards five kind of thing because Bam's not guarding Porzingis at this stage. It's Kevin Love. And then they're putting it's not like Bam is now guarding Kevin Love's guy at the 4. He's guarding Jalen Brown. So I think that stuff is fun to kind of just track and see that there's so much versatility on both sides. And I think that's kind of the big thing is offensively, they do have a lot of versatility. They have a lot of things that they can get to. Drew is a guy I just I like him as a player, but it's also funny to see like when he joins a team with Tatum and Jalen Brown, and he's able to play off ball in that way. First play of the game, he hits the spot up corner 3 because they helped off too far, and Kyle was dipping off. But it's like okay, that's the different dynamic that he can bring. It's like it's not a lot of on ball necessary, and that's what he did in Milwaukee too. I guess it was a lot of kind of giving the ball up and being able to play in that role and being willing to do it. And I think that was big as well. So I think my biggest question, I guess, from an outside perspective of Boston was how Horford will be utilized. And I don't know if that's probably something that you guys are still probably trying to figure out as well. But like, where does he plug in specifically, and how are they going to work lineups around him and all that stuff? And I think spinning it back into yesterday's game, it's like I think the question is obviously Boston's depth and how they will kind of produce throughout the season. And then Miami obviously didn't have a lot of depth yesterday. They think, a healthy roster, that's one of their biggest strengths. Yesterday, when you have those guys out, the depth did not look great, in my opinion. So when you have when you're relying on starters versus starters, top players versus top players, it's a tough team to compete against when you're looking at that starting five on Boston's side and you're trying to just throw haymakers at each other. And Jimmy's also coasting. So I thought that was just kind of the big thing for them.
It's probably the number one question with this team, that big spot, and how much it sustains throughout the year.
Hmm.
Porzingis played 38 minutes on opening night. Last night, he probably comes in a little bit low with the foul trouble and fouling out. I got the exact number here in front of me somewhere, but the injuries with him. I mean, he hasn't played much more than 60 games in any of the recent years. Last year was a little bit of an anomaly for him staying on the court for longer. And, he talked during the preseason that could have been maybe even closer to 70 games if he didn't get sick. So 30 minutes last night, probably would have been around 36-ish, 35 if he didn't have foul trouble. So, can you use him a ton? Can you rely on him throughout the floor of the year? It's good to have Horford there. And it looks like, they talked a lot about going lineup by committee throughout the year. If they weren't going to go double big in this one and try to match up with Miami's size, I don't know where they're going to do it. Like, I feel like they're just going to run that small lineup out there and try to use that to their advantage no matter who they're seeing on the other side, especially when, Luke Cornett really struggled during the preseason. First game, they ran him for 11 minutes and it didn't go great. Neemias Queta showed some signs in preseason, but still doesn't really seem like a guy that they trust at that spot yet. And of course, Grant's gone. So, you have O'Shea who can maybe slide over and guard some five. He did it in this last game against Bam on a possession or two. But overall, it's Porzingis and Horford, and you need those guys to stay healthy. You need them to stay fresh in Horford's case. Like if Porzingis goes down for 2-3 weeks at some
Hmm.
point, it's going to be 30, 40 minutes of Horford on a lot of
Yeah.
nights. And at 37, does that just take that much more of a toll with him? I didn't think he looked great in this one. He grabbed some boards, played some good defense, closed the game once Porzingis fouled out. So the contribution was useful, but, they just
Hmm.
have trouble finding his spots offensively and utilizing him on the floor as anything other than a spot up three guy at this point. And if he misses a couple and doesn't impact that area, he really doesn't give you much offensively at this point. He did have an offensive rebound here or there, so I don't want to be too hard on his performance here, but it's going to be an adjustment for him moving to the bench.
Yeah, I know he was not as involved, I guess, as I thought he would be, specifically in this matchup when he was coming in that role. But I will say, I mean, when you're mentioning kind of them playing the smaller lineups around like a Porzingis or a Horford, I think from Miami's perspective, they actually like that. Like, I think because I mean, they're not a team that's like, okay, you're out there with two bigs, we're throwing out two bigs. If you're out there small, we're going out small. Like, I don't think that's the way that Spo has never been that type of guy, but they naturally are always going to play smaller. That's what Eric Spoelstra does. He is not somebody that likes playing, too many bigs. It's Bam and it's any guard at the four most times, actually. So I think that's something you'll see a lot of. I think they'll actually match up pretty well. And that's when I think, in a future, let's say, playoff series, it'll be a lot more Bam on Porzingis, I think, than what we saw yesterday, because Kevin Love's minutes are probably definitely going to be shrinking. I mean, I think his role is mostly going to be maybe 5 or 6 minutes to the first quarter, 5 or 6 minutes to start the third quarter, and that's it. And then all of a sudden down the stretch, you have your other role player wings and guards that kind of put around Bam. So I think it's going to be two teams that are kind of have the same mindset lineup wise. Like they're kind of looking at things similarly and trying to figure out, once again, like even if, they're trying to figure out, okay, Drew off ball here, Tatum on ball here, Tatum off ball here, and moving things around with those three guys. It's like, that's how Miami's trying to figure things out, because Tyler and Jimmy are not, let's say, the best, greatest offensive fit ever, because they're two guys that are demanding the ball as well when necessary. They just are. And as good as Tyler is off the ball, it's other stuff that goes in him being great. It's like him flying off stuff and then getting the ball and attacking, or coming off a pin down and then getting the ball and shooting or doing stuff. So it's like it's always like kind of those, we've heard the Jaylen Brown and Tatum stuff of taking turns. That's kind of what
Yeah,
Jimmy and Tyler do in a sense, because they
you're
kind of
right.
have this similar thing. So in a way, with the new look Boston, I actually think it's a kind of a one-on-one kind of fun thing to see back and forth, to see the coaching kind of how they adjust.
Yeah, and what do you think of Boston's defensive looks? Obviously, it's a ton of drop.
Hmm.
They pulled out this little press thing for a play or two there around halftime. They
Mm.
started playing up and looked like they were going to fool around with that. But I think the theme for Boston's defense early on has been, ooh, we're trying a lot of stuff behind the scenes. You might see some zone, you might see some pressing here. You saw them sprinkle some of that stuff in during the preseason. But I do think at their core, it's just going to be something that they sprinkle in here or there. I don't think we're going to see them run zone as much as a Miami does. I don't think we're going to see them press much, if at all. But you
Hmm.
see it come out there, and I'm already starting to think like, oh, all right, are they going to start to pull Miami here in this matchup? But mostly drop. A little bit of switching with the fives. You saw Horford out on Jimmy for a couple plays. You saw Porzingis get that block out on here, defending him in space, which was very
Yeah.
impressive. But overall, it looks like they're just going to kind of be a drop team, switching a lot 1 through 4. And Holiday helps a ton in that regard because, there really wasn't a matchup he could shine in defensively in this game. But opening night against Randall, he's guarding him and holding him to 1 of 10 on those switches. And it
Mm.
was the swing factor in that game.
Yeah, I mean I think the drop perspective of it is what Miami sees as the opening. Like you go back to the year before
Oh,
last,
yeah.
where it was like Tyler coming into it was the game 7 between Milwaukee and Boston. Miami already got into the Eastern Conference Finals. And I remember we asked Tyler, we're like which team would you rather see? And he was like, you know what team I'd rather see. Like he'd rather see Milwaukee because they're just gonna be sitting under the rim all game and he could have his looks. Whereas Boston, they mix in the switching where it's a little bit tougher to get to his spots. But now obviously there's a little bit of an opening there. But when you mentioned switching 1 through 4, I think that's kind of the biggest gift of this new kind of Boston starting lineup because I think they really can mix things in and just kind of switch all of that. When Tyler
Holiday's
comes off a
something.
screen, Holiday, Derek White obviously can hold up, but even if they don't do that, they could send the help and rotate over. Like they can do a lot of different things with that 1 through 4 look. That'll probably be the main thing they get to. And if Horford, like you mentioned, comes in for Porzingis and you run that lineup, they could switch 1 through 5 theoretically. So I think that's an interesting wrinkle that they can obviously throw in defensively, probably even more than the zone and stuff. Because it's funny because as much as people talk about the zone and putting against Miami, like if there was a team, and I'm not just the one saying this just to say it, but like if there was a team that I would be like unwilling to do it against, it's Miami just because they work on it every day.
Right.
Like
Yeah,
they're
you didn't
ones
see
that are
much of it at
drilling
all last night.
they're the ones drilling this zone, so they see it in practice and they have to work against the zone. So I think they're a team that probably is best suit in terms of just reps of knowing how to break a zone in general. But obviously, I think teams like Boston could dare them to just say, "Hey, we don't believe in your shooting. We're throwing out this zone. Let's see if you can hit 40% of your threes." Like that, I could see that happening at certain points. But overall, I just think that's the interesting part is that 1 through 4 look if they do decide to kind of buy into that overall switching because that seems like the thing that could potentially break Miami's offense down. And obviously, what is Miami's in the playoffs biggest offensive look against Boston? It was always Jimmy trying to find the switch that he wants, and I think they still can do that. But there's less options of him picking. Like I think against the bench lineup specifically, he could say, "Okay, I want to get this guy on my back. I want to find Pritchard. I want to get him in the mid post." Like
He
there's that stuff they
dominated
can do.
White in these finals, but in this game, turned
Hmm.
a little bit. In different situations, of course, but he ends up going 0 for 3 against White in this one. So, he really wasn't able to do that in this game, and he really didn't try too much. So, we'll see what happens next time. I don't think these two teams play each other for a little while here, but I do want to talk a little bit longer about that Drew trade and just how it changes things in the East here. But first, a quick word from FanDuel.
Into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/Boston and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL.
So, Drew Holiday, you talked a little bit about him. Still getting used to this team. Obviously, just arrived about 2, 3 weeks ago now with that trade. And as far as what this team does defensively, I think something like a zone would have been more intriguing when they were playing bigger, when they had Rob and Porzingis out there together and they were going with all that length and size. But they end up making the trade, Rob, Brogdon, a couple future firsts, and going with another guard here. And I love it just because you see it again last night. This is all stuff Smart would do for them, and even higher level here in Holiday. Of course, the shooting is much better too. And I thought they were really going to miss that Smart stuff when they traded him. I didn't love the Porzingis trade at first. Had some questions about him that I think he's answered early on here. And then on top of that, you get your Smart impact here in Holiday with the switching, with guarding up positions, and even as just the kind of defensive quarterback for this team. It's an interesting matchup with the Heat, though, because he struggled against them in that first round series last year. Butler really took advantage of him. Offensively in the playoffs, he struggled to shoot for the last couple of years here, which is going to be interesting to watch too when that time comes. But as far as Smart replacement here, if you were going to pick anybody, it'd be Drew. So I think the trade made all the sense in the world, despite giving up a great shooter in Brogdon and a really versatile, impactful defender in Rob.
Yeah, I think when people saw the trade of Smart going out, like from an outside perspective, it was like, okay, the perimeter defense makes you feel a little bit better about them, in the playoffs that you could they lost that type of defender and now you can do different things. But then you replace them with kind of a more efficient version of Marcus Smart, obviously, who's a much more trusted offensive player. Uh Obviously, you see the stats in the bottom, 7 for 13, and then obviously he was 1 for 4 from three. I think that's kind of going to be the thing in the playoffs when there's more, I guess, less rim attempts and it's more about the outside shot, because we've seen that over past years. And that's kind of what it comes down to for Drew. Like when he had like the really good run that one year, it was like his shooting was pretty decent. And it's like, if you kind of force him to shoot and kind of see what that looks like, which is, it's going to be similar, honestly, to what they did with Marcus Smart. Because if you remember, obviously, he's the guy you dip off of and force to shoot. But in a way, when you're looking at this Boston starting lineup, Drew is probably the guy that you're still dipping off of, because you're not dipping off of Derek White much. You're not dipping off of Tatum or Brown, and obviously what Porzingis is at this stage. Like he's probably the guy you're choosing. So he's kind of the X factor in a lot of these matchups to shoot the basketball, because he's the one that can open things up most. So I think that part of it will be interesting. But yeah, the defensive stuff you mentioned, we were just talking about switching all over the place. He can handle himself against bigger players. Boston's a team that is not worried about that much. Like we see a lot of Jaylen Brown unbanned in these matchups. Like they trust that matchup in the low post. They say like, okay, we dare Bam to kind of play the post, because that's not his greatest attribute offensively. It's more about the face-up stuff. So they do that type of stuff, where now they could do that with Drew, but even differently, because he's that much more physical, that much of a guy on the perimeter and all that stuff. But once, like you said, though, Jimmy Butler, seeing that matchup is not like petrified. Let's just say that, because after what he just did in that first round, it's like he was able to pick him apart. And I have literally never seen Drew Holiday look like that defensively, because what he was doing offensively was just so tough to deal with. That was just such a surprise. Will we see that again? We'll see. But that part of it aside, it's like they got what they needed. I do like the move for Boston to get Drew Holiday on both sides of the floor. And look, and he's losing Marcus Smart, aside from the basketball stuff, which is always what I go to first. But losing Marcus Smart as a team leader, I mean, there's not many better people to get than Drew Holiday to kind of be in that locker, to lead that group, to kind of be around the young guys. So I thought that was a really good move for them just overall.
Yeah, he's played very unselfishly so far too. Uh, Went to the bench early in the preseason, seemed willing to do it if necessary. We'll still see how that plays out. It seems like he's going to be a starter here with Horford off the bench, but yeah, he didn't have any issues with that. And such a willing screener so far. You mentioned his positioning in the offense. It's going to be hard to play off him when he's a screener so often, and kind of shifting the matchups there, especially against a team like Miami, where you're bringing guards into the matchup so often. So his screening's great. It's a nice compliment for White, who I think is an awesome screener too with that guard spot. Celtics loves setting screens with their guards, especially away from the ball. We haven't seen a ton of the off-ball movement and actions with them yet early in the schedule. It's been a lot of high screen and roll with the Porzingis Tatum combination there. But in a game like this, where Miami moves to cut off Porzingis, all of a sudden you're able to bring in the guards to the actions with Holiday screens and White screens. I don't have the screening numbers in front of me
Yeah.
here, but it feels like they're 2 games. Holiday's just set a million screens for these guys because it's where he's going to get involved. And the one thing, I actually wrote about this morning, Brady. The one thing you wonder with a team like this a little bit is the sacrifice aspect, because obviously they have 4 stars. There's going to be a guy basically every night who isn't going to get his shots, who isn't going to score. And this one, it was Horford. In the first game, Brown took no shots in the fourth quarter.
Hmm.
And every night you're going to be kind of, writing, asking questions about it, saying like, oh, how'd this happen? How do you feel about this? And so far, all the guys have reacted pretty well to their sacrifice, whatever it is. Drew, I think, is going to be off the ball a lot more on this team. Jalen, I think, is going to go way down the scoring hierarchy here and have to contribute in other ways. And Horford's going to have to come off the bench as he has so far, it looks like. So you always wonder about that. Winning cures all, and they're 2-0 right now, but it takes a lot of buy-in to make something like this work, especially for these guys who have had prominent roles on their past teams here. And the way that they've reacted to that so far, I think, has to be the most encouraging thing.
Yeah, that definitely is necessary. And I think that's something, obviously Miami talks a lot about kind of buying into certain stuff, but with their young guys, kind of with the undrafted stories I hear about all the time. It's tough to buy in. Like a guy like RJ Hampton that comes in and gets a two-way that has no business getting a two-way. That part of this game is so necessary to be able to take chances like that. So when you go all in, like as on a Boston team, and you get a bunch of guys to put in your lineup and say kind of figure it out, which is essentially what they're doing because they have so many guys that can obviously do stuff offensively. You have to have the guy that's willing to play off ball. You have to have the guy that's willing to take less shots. And like you said, we'll see who that is. Maybe it doesn't have to be the same guy every game. Like in theory, I think that's probably best, kind of depending on matchup. Maybe you kind of move things around. But still, I think there has to be a one or two of those guys mentally saying, okay, if I go into this game and I only get this many shots, I have to be okay with that. And obviously, it's not going to be Tatum. Jaylen Brown and Drew Holiday will probably have to kind of balance that a little bit and kind of figure out who that guy is. I think Drew is probably going to be much more willing just because he's done it before and he's played on kind of big teams in that range, and he's older and he's a
It's
veteran and
his
he
game
can do it.
too. Like
It
he
is.
can be a lot more complimentary and pass first.
It's similar to Jimmy because Jimmy says like I don't care about my shots and he kind of do it in the mud. Drew can do it in the mud.
Oh
Drew
yeah.
doesn't need to be flashy and do all that stuff. He can just say, okay, if I hit a passing lane and get a steal and go in the other direction and that's my offensive game, I'm okay with that because he's done it before. That's kind of his dog mentality. So I think he that's what him being in this fold. I think just it's probably best for this Boston team because he's done it before.
So you get your 6 guys here. We've talked about them all. How many guys on top of that you think have to step up for this team? You're obviously going to go 7, 8 deep in the playoffs,
Hmm.
give or take here. And then, of course, if injury strike or anything else happens here, it's going to pull someone else up. Not a ton of Pritchard in this game. Hauser really struggled early. I thought that was when Miami was at its best, was when he was out there early. And then, of course, they shifted away from him to Brissett, who's pretty good. But overall, not a ton of bench involvement from Boston so far this season. Cornette got his little run on opening night. You add Lamar Stevens to this group, who we haven't seen yet. Shvi Mihailuk played pretty well in the preseason. Haven't seen him yet. So it's not a deep bench. It's not a bona fide bench full of contributors that are going to help out night in and night out. And you're adding Horford to this mix, obviously now 2 on most nights, it seems like. If you were going to look at any one of these guys you think could potentially emerge here and be that contributor consistently for this group, like does Brissett have a chance coming out of this first game here? Will we finally see Pritchard more, after the big preseason he had? Or will Hauser kind of resettle himself and have a year similar to last year? Of course, he wasn't a guy who really contributed at all to that Heat series here. So Joe plays a little thinner, a little tighter. But you're always going to need some bench contributions, as Miami knows well.
For sure. And I think that's been the big question is about their depth. I think Brissett's probably the most interesting one because he's the guy that Boston can play off the bench and can stay on the floor the longest, it feels like, in my opinion, where they could go like in a big game, in a playoff game, let's say, and they need somebody to kind of stay out there and just eat minutes. He's the guy that you could probably say is probably the safest bet because he does the small things. He can kind of do a lot of that stuff against wing guys. So I think that makes a lot of sense. As for, the Pritchards of the world, I think, they're going to need those guys in the regular season, man. They really are. Because obviously you mentioned, like, if one of these guys goes down for 2 weeks, everything shifts. And now all of a sudden you have a little bit of usage to utilize and you need somebody to step up. And I think kind of the big thing, the question will be, can this Boston team be like a high level 3-point shooting team? Because if they can have those guys on the floor and shoot at a high level, like, yeah, you're sitting very nicely. If that's not the case and you're having these kind of blips as a shooting group off the bench specifically, it's harder to keep those guys on the floor. And then all of a sudden you're playing a team that can attack those guys, and now it makes it a little bit tougher. So Brissett's the one that kind of intrigues me. And then obviously this is a team. I think people have called this team a regular season team because they have the talent. But I think the wonder will be, can they be a playoff team as well? Because when it cuts down to 7-man rotation, they have a pretty strong 7 guys in general. So that'll be the part to monitor. What's regular season team versus playoff team kind of battle, I guess we're going to have until the end of the season with most teams, I guess. But this team feels like kind of a pretty decent chance to kind of fill both of those kind of holes.
Yeah, and they have a good chance to extend this hot start they're on here. It's Washington on Monday, Indiana on Wednesday, who plays them pretty tough, who I think is a pretty good team, but should be beatable, and then on to Brooklyn next Saturday. So could be a 5-0 start at least here for this team if they take care of business. The Heat are in Minnesota tonight as we record this. Bucks on Monday, which is going to be fun. Brooklyn on Wednesday, and then Washington and the Lakers later into November. So they're going to have a little bit of a challenge here to start. Of course, the biggest thing with this team, we've talked about with Wes Goldberg and a couple of the other guys down there, not getting Lillard, having to pick up the pieces after that, integrate in some new guys here. Of course, we talked about Drew Smith and Josh Richardson's back, which I think was kind of an underrated move. He can get healthy. Highsmith, you mentioned, is pretty good. Played well in the playoffs when they called on him. And then, down the line here, a lot of younger guys. Surprised we haven't seen Jovic yet. Jaquez hasn't done a ton, especially in this Boston game. So, you're just almost confident at this point that these kind of guys are going to step up for Miami. But you also forget that it is a process, and there's a reason these guys are kind of unsung and undrafted and whatever it might be. Not all of them are going to hit. Some it might take time, some it might be matchup dependent. But as usual, without the Lillard trade here, we are with the Heat having to rely on an influx of guys that, at least for right now, the league at large really isn't that familiar with. So what are you expecting out of them this year in general? Like, can these guys step up again and get them into the playoffs and lead them on a run? Or it's going to be a little different without guys like Strus and Vincent, who they really came to rely on?
Yeah, I think they're not expecting Jimmy to play a whole lot of games. I think that's number one. You could see that at the way he played last night, and then obviously he's resting tonight. That's going to be the case. So it's going to be a lot of Tyler and Bam. The question has been kind of how can they be like a top 5 defense? I think is number one, because they have the defensive guys on this roster. They were kind of hanging around that range last year. So the question is, can they be in that fold? And obviously it does not help when 3 of your better perimeter wing defenders are all out at the same time. Like, talk about just a terrible roll of the dice. But Jovic, you mentioned, obviously was kind of the guy that we were saying could potentially be the guy that pops and kind of gives them new life and maybe a new look. But I just don't think he's ready. I don't think he's ready right now. I think Spo's kind of talked about the fact that he just needs the ball in his hands. And I don't think he's great enough at this stage as a spot-up shooter to keep him on the floor long enough. And when you need the ball in your hands and kind of playing this, like, he'll play tonight, he'll probably play pretty decent. He'll play a lot of playmaker and do a lot of that type of stuff. But in terms of like when a healthy Heat roster is out there, it's tough to kind of find his role in that range. As for Jaime Jaquez, he's a guy that's ready right now. He's a guy that, in that opening game, had, not a flashy stat line, but he played like really strong, had good minutes. He looked under control. That's a guy that can obviously plug right in, specifically when Jimmy's out, because he's talked about how he watches so much of Jimmy's film and all this stuff. He tries to mirror his game after him. They'll literally just kind of plug him right into that role and see what he can do. And then the other guys, it's just about, like I said, defensively, 3-and-D guys. Like, it's literally that simple for this team. They need guys that are going to, you mentioned pressing and zone, that are going to guard you baseline to baseline, like Haywood Highsmith or Josh Richardson, and just absolutely hound you. And ideally could shoot 38, 39, 40% from 3 on the other end, and you're kind of sitting in a nice spot. So it's about, can they get that? Because look, they went from a first seed in the Eastern Conference to being in the play-in. pretty much because they were number 1 in three-point shooting to 30th in three-point shooting. So for this team, it really might be as simple as that. So we'll see if they can get that punch. It really is about getting healthy and kind of finding that range. A lot of people do bring up Gabe and Max. I like them as players in general, but when you look at their numbers last season, it's not a hard thing to replace. 33, 35% shooting from three, not a crazy number of points per game. They can have guys step up in that way to kind of fill that gap statistically. But the question will be, can Tyler take that leap? Can Bam take that leap? And I think the focus on right now is pretty much Tyler, because he's the one that's going to have the ball in his hands a ton.
Yeah, and then of course it's a trade factor too. You could still go out and make a trade. They got some contracts here that are going to be interesting in that regard, especially the Lowry one they're expiring. And the one guy I'm looking at, and we mentioned briefly earlier, who I think could help this team, and there's a whole Portland Miami thing that they're going to have to get past from the offseason. But Malcolm Brogdon, strong start out there in Portland, playmaker, shooter, experienced veteran who can play next to this team's stars, doesn't need the ball in his hand to succeed. And of course, it'd be the added dynamic of him trying to get back at Boston after they traded him here, if that's still any motivation in his mind. One of my predictions going into this year, and something I'm looking out for, is whether Miami could make a move for a guy like that. I think the money relatively lines up with Lowry and Brogdon. And of course, Portland would be willing to part with him for the right price, I'd imagine, given where they're at in their rebuild now. But he's looked good in his first couple of games. I don't know if you've watched them a ton, but hitting his threes again, close to 20 points a game off the bench for them in their first 2 games up there. I think that'd be a good target for them. Something like that. Just an infusion of offense, a guy who can still execute what they want to do defensively, and just is more of a bona fide night-to-night contributor than a lot of the guys we just talked about.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, they really do need point guard. Like, that's kind of the big thing here. It's like nobody
Lowry, man.
expected Kyle Lowry to be the starting being in the starting
Yeah,
lineup this year.
that's
Like,
not a
nobody
good
did.
look right now.
And when you don't have a backup point guard to back that guy up, when you're putting Drew Smith in there, who was just newly signed to a contract, who people did not think was going to be signed to a contract. People didn't think he was going to get a two-way, even kind of solidify that two-way. And here he is, kind of playing big time minutes, being literally the first guy off the bench against Boston in the second game of the year. They do need point guard help. They need to figure that kind of who that guy could be. I don't think it's going to be a big name. Brogdon's an interesting one because he can play that kind of on-ball point guard role, get guys in their spots, kind of play off ball, do a lot of stuff that, if a guy's out, he can kind of play in that range of a heavy pick and roll player. So it is an interesting perspective that they could kind of mix that type of guy in. But I don't know. They need somebody. They do need a point guard at some point in this season, because Kyle's not playing close to 82. And then when it gets to the playoffs, you're not playing Kyle close to 35 minutes either. They want to tame his minutes. They want to tame his game. So it's like at some point you're going to have to figure something out to have an innings eater of some kind to kind of just be serviceable. Because I'm not a guy that's like needs to be, traditional point guard, traditional this, traditional that. But you do need a guy that can kind of settle you into offense once when necessary. You can't just at all times run everything through giving the ball to your big man and running down the floor. Because Bam's kind of their best playmaker at this stage, and he's the guy that does it at extremely high level. But you're asking this guy to be your best defender, one of the best defenders in basketball, score 20 points per game, and then also be your best playmaker. Like, at some point, you got to take the burden off of this guy.
They've done that a ton through 2 games too. I watched a little bit of that Detroit game in the opener, and it's a big part of that game too. Just him in that high post with the ball in his hands, and they're gonna have to have a conversation too about what the goal is. This, at least to start the year, it doesn't look like a championship team. Of course, the conversation around them is always going to be the star hunting, and Giannis is, of course, locked up in Milwaukee now, so that's not going to happen. And the Lillard thing is come and gone here. But, what do they have their sights on long term here? Butler's going to need a contract before long, and it's going to be a big one. So, you want to contend before you have to make that tough decision here. And, it'd be great if they could catch these young guys up to speed and be that disruptor again that they often are here, make the finals. But when push came to shove last year, as great as they were for those first 3 rounds, they really weren't close to Denver other than a few runs in a couple of those games. So it's still a team that you're probably not looking at as a champion for this year. And I don't think a Brogdon changes that. So, how much do you hold your cards here and try to go for something big down the line? it's tough because of that Butler factor, right? Like, how many more years does he have of being that guy who's going to drive you through the playoffs here, with all the miles on him, with his age at this point? They're in a tough spot where they got to kind of go for it while also having this younger roster that's a little bit more behind where he's at. Even a Bam is on a different kind of timeline than Butler is right now, it seems like. So that's a tough question for Miami here. If you got Lillard, you'd probably be talking about championship. And at least with what we know right now and what we see in front of us, it's hard to imagine them doing that this year.
They definitely have two different timelines, as you mentioned, but they are 100% leaning into the current window. Like they have to. When you have a guy like Jimmy Butler, there's no selling off and going the opposite direction, especially with this team. This team is never going to do that. They're always going to say compete right now. And I just, I think the big thing is if Tyler could take that next step, that is what they have to bank on at this stage, because you could say, well, we didn't have that in the playoffs. Then you add ideally a 22, maybe 23 point per game scorer into the mix. So you say, okay, we have now this new element if he could stay healthy. And then, there's always the signing of Jimmy, kind of that contract thing. They're 100% going to give him a contract because he's like the next guy in line. He's the next Heat guy that is just going to be here probably for the rest of his career. And there's still as much as we could talk about them, obviously not being pretty on paper. And that's what they've preached this year is they say the championship is not won on paper, this and that. That's always going to be their mindset. They just feel like get them to the dance, get them to the thing. And they feel like they have one of the best coaches, if not the best coach in basketball, and a top playoff performer, that they'll have a decent opportunity when that time comes. So this is always going to be their mindset. Yes, they are star hunting. It does not feel like they've hunted in a bit. They have not gotten anything in a bit. And we keep ending up in this same spot. But look, there's this cycle. And it feels like every time we get to this point, it's with Jimmy Butler. It's the October Jimmy. Everybody's complaining. Everybody's like, what is this guy doing? He's lost his step. What's going on? He gets to kind of that February, March area, and he starts to pick it back up a little bit. And then he gets to April, and then he starts to turn it on. And it's like this same cycle every year. And it's funny because Heat fans know it. They've seen it. But every time we get back to this starting point in October and November, everybody starts to freak out again.
He shows up in some sort of, look for the media day.
Yes,
you can just come to expect
usually
how it's going to go.
It's a process for him. This is his process. He knows that he's going to kind of save himself in a way for that time and kind of get to that certain point. And if he's proven that it works for him and he puts on, what they need when the time comes, you can't be mad at it. And I think the big thing for Miami is saying, well, if he's going to mess around in the regular season and you were just a playing team, we're going to end up back in that same range. And now you have to fight and play a Milwaukee or a Boston or one of these top teams in the first round again. And ideally, you need a superhero performance from Jimmy again. Like, no, you want to try to get a top 4 seed and compete in that range and kind of be in that type of bracket. And once again, it really is going to come down to Tyler and Bam. It just is. That's what this team is banking on at this stage, that those guys can kind of take that step. The role players are good enough, which they always seem to be. The role players are always going to be good enough, it feels like, on this team. So if Tyler and Bam can kind of have that pretty much the game that they had last night, like if they can play like that consistently, they stayed in the game against a really good Boston team and obviously fell short. But if you're playing the rest of the league like that with Tyler and Bam and, shooting at a high level, which I think they shot like 49% from 3 last night, which is crazy to think about in a loss. But if you're able to do that consistently, that's kind of the goal, to kind of get a top 4 seed in the playoffs and then kind of bank on your main guy, Jimmy Butler, when it comes down to it.
I think that's what you can come to expect with this team for sure. And Brady Hawk's a guy that you can come to expect giving some great coverage of them. Follow along with him, 5 Reasons Sports. He's at Twitter, at Brady Hawk, 305. Obviously, the Heat's still a team that's very pertinent to the Celtics here. So some great coverage from you on the ground down there. East Finals were fun last year, per usual. And looking forward to some trips down to Miami this year. In the chat, loving you too. A lot of Daniel Tice comparisons. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Never heard that before, but hey, it's a Boston channel, so.
All right, Brady. Appreciate your time.
Appreciate
you always. And we'll talk to you later in the year.
Yes, sir. Thank you for having me.
All right. And quick shout out to our sponsors here. Of course, FanDuel, we mentioned them. Sunday is tomorrow. So go over there for all the spreads, odds, futures with football going on right now. Of course, some college games going on today as well. You can still get in on the action with, and being in on the action and making every moment more is what FanDuel is all about. Our official sports wagering partner here is going to give you $200 in bonus bets. When you bet $5, you know the offer, you know the URL, fanduel.com/Boston. Head over there. Basketball rolling along as well now every night. You got the Heat, you got the Timberwolves tonight, you got the Celtics getting going on Monday again against the Wizards. I'm sure that's a big line. So go find that number. And all the futures, if you're getting excited about Boston racing to a championship here, you might want to get on them as well. So fanduel.com/Boston. Go check that out. Use our URL, please. Big help to us. And if you want some tips on your picks here, this is a great resource. Odds are they're going to give you a 30-day free trial. It's AI learning that gives you the bets. They're not taking your bet. They're giving you the bets to win. And, they got a whole rating system here. Green is go for it. Yellow, slow down. Think about this one. Go for it if you'd like, but don't blame us. And then red, don't do it. So go over there and check it out. Again, you get 30 days free when you head to oddsr.com/Celtics. Great compliment for FanDuel if you're using that. So oddsr.com/Celtics. Just go check it out again. Use our code to show us some support here. And HelloFresh. Love HelloFresh. One of our favorite sponsors here across the board. Sherrod's a big fan. I love it. Joe Sway has been using it quite a bit here this fall. So head over to HelloFresh.com/CLNS50 and check out if it's for you. It's for most people, you might not love cooking, but they got the prepackaged ingredients. They got the instructions laid out in front of you that can, with their quick and easy options, get you a dinner in under 30 minutes here. So go check it out. A lot of fall fresh options are available right now. They're always changing up the menu too, which is nice. It's customizable, it's flexible, and it's convenient. Don't have to be running to the supermarket, and certainly compared to going out to eat is a much cheaper option here. So head to HelloFresh.com/CLNS50. See how they fit into your busy fall schedule, and check out their dozens and dozens of options here that you can switch up each week and pick your times and all the rest. It's HelloFresh.com/CLNS50. 50% off and free shipping when you go to HelloFresh.com/CLNS50, America's #1 meal kit. I'm Bobby Manning. We got a nice day off tomorrow after a pretty crazy first week here for the Celtics. Enjoyed these games. We'll get into some film at some point here from the first week of games, and we'll have post-game coverage remote here of Celtics Wizards on Monday. They're down in Washington getting ready to play that one before they come back out to play the Pacers on Wednesday. So a couple manageable games here. Tough matchup on Wednesday, I think. And then we'll actually be down in New York next weekend, a week from today, for the Nets game. So looking forward to that. Appreciate you guys supporting as always. Big crowds after these games. It's been awesome having you guys so far and checking in for some of our guest editions here. Thanks again to Brady. And if you missed our post-game show last night, you can go check that out on demand right now. Joe Sway and I filmed some videos at the Garden. Those are over on Celtics All Access. Give that a subscribe. And that's our Garden Report for today.